How the melting of the polar ice caps can start a new Cold War. There'll be more military buildups. The melting of the caps are seeing more military vessels in our hemisphere. The impact can be both economic and social because growing up during the 70s and 80s, I lived during the Cold War, and when I first found out, was old enough to understand what was going on, I realized that there's going to be a lot of problems, and that we grew up worried about whether or not Russia was going to, the USSR at that time was going to launch nukes, and then we would have what's called mutually assured destruction. So this is a big threat that we were worried about. I mean, there was videos that, and this preceded even me there because there was duck and cover. There's all these things back from the 50s. So this was a big threat that we had always worried about. So when I enlisted in 1989, the wall was still up. So we most of our training and basic training was centered around, our tactics were developed towards fighting the Soviets at that time. And we weren't really too concerned about them invading America. It was more just concerned about whether or not they would fire their nukes and then we would fire our nukes. And then, we would have what they called mutually assured destruction. But for our hemisphere, because mostly just because of the logistics of the ice caps and moving in there, it was always extremely difficult to try to figure this thing out, or to try to how they could logistically get ships into our hemisphere. So we were always covered, and we didn't have to worry about actual invasion. But now, as the polar ice caps are melting, it's opening up new pathways, and so these are my slides. I'm going to go over my slides, and just to maybe elaborate a little bit more. So we're talking about different places in AP. So this melting cap, see more vessels in our hemisphere, right? So Yokosuka, Japan, to the world's military leaders, debate over climate change is long over. They are preparing for a new Cold War in the Arctic and anticipating that rising temperatures there will open up a treasure trove of resources and long dreamed of sea lanes and a slew of potential conflicts. Right, because what's happening now is all these different superpowers, military powers now want to get into that region, and we could have serious problems because they could, as you could have what's called, so you could have what's like this Cold War, or you could have soft wars where it's just ships moving in, and you just kind of agree to not engage each other. But eventually, other powers like China and Russia, they're going to want to, especially as they realize they can start drilling in this area, and then there's all kinds of resources. They're going to try to push some influence over there because they want to have access to the resources, because these are limited resources and everybody needs them. I mean, we're seeing, because our country is moving towards solar, problem is you need lots and lots of lithium. And these are, so you're seeing China has a big portion of the world's, minerals and all these different things that we need to build windmills and solar panels. So this is becoming a major problem, and opening up a whole new area of the world where drilling and all these things can occur, and also shipping all kinds of vessels into our area. That becomes a problem too, because now they want to get all their merchant ships through our area. So one of the big things that as military you always think about is who, especially American military, you always think, and I'm sure other militaries probably think the same thing. So what happens then is we, especially when it comes to the sea, you always think about, for us, fortunately, we have the biggest navy. But in the years past, we're seeing more and more countries like China and Russia and other countries building up their navy because they know that your navy is your ability to project power. It says, while the U.S. Navy is planning to build 10 ships every year, the Chinese shipyards have been documented building up to 9 ships at a time. And then you're going to see in some of the websites that I show you how they're building. Right now we have by far the most amount of aircraft carriers, and that's the most important because your aircraft carriers your ability to project strength. But as you'll see, the Chinese military, they now have 2, but their plans to building considerably more. So it says, one of the photos that they illustrated shows that there was under construction a number that would dwarf the UK's Royal Navy, who was just 6 destroyers in service. Impact is economic and social of a new Cold War. The U.S. Cold War economic policies were in contrast to those the United States pursued to win World War II. To win the Cold War, the United States became a low savings, high consumption economy. It basically supported its allies in a recovery, develop, and growth process to out-consume the USSR return rate. So they tried to, the whole thing was to spend them into oblivion. So that's all part of Keynesian economics. That goes into where we've kind of got to at this point, and it was used for military spending, but obviously after the Cold War, they just kept that spending philosophy, and now we may not need to retract some of the social stuff to focus on the military, which I believe is the primary function of the federal government. So I'm going to go to show a couple of the different websites. Let's see. So right here it talks. Wait, okay. Of course, there's an ad. The Independent. Let's see. Hold on. So of course there's an ad. I have to go back to it. Okay. So global warming is melting ice caps, but there are fears that it could lead to a new Cold War. So in this article they talk about from news to politics, travel, sports, the risk posed by global warming also has ramifications for economies around the world. Rising sea levels, right? So it talks about rising sea, the flood risks create problems, but there is at least one way in which climate change will prove attractive to businesses. As the ice caps melt, a whole new section of the globe is opening up. Areas of the Arctic that were once impassable now represent the gateway to the greater trade. Shipping times from China and Russia to Europe could be reduced by 1/3 if vessels travel through the Arctic rather than traditional routes. Right, so that's one of the things that they talk about, that yes, this can be beneficial, but what we're going to see is it will happen to become more places where possible engagements can occur. And right now we live in a very volatile time, especially with economies being so impacted because of the restrictions from the lockdowns, as that the governments in place because of COVID. So what the problem is that while most of the Western or our allied countries have completely locked down, and that has caused great revenue shortages, because with businesses being locked down you lose all that money and people being out of work. So instead of now taking in revenues, we're spending, we're doing stimulus bills, and so therefore these stimulus bills are just to keep people afloat and not towards infrastructure or building military. And whereas China pretty much doesn't have anything locked down, and they're pumping out all their goods all across the world. Now they're taking in revenues from the sales of those goods, and they're using that, one, for influence throughout the world, but also in military. So this has become a huge problem for, or why the climate changing in that region of the world can have many, many, horrible side effects, and the one could be a new Cold War. That's all I have for now, and if you have any questions, please feel free to message me.